Rosalie noticed the empty chair before she noticed the message. The restaurant was busy for a Thursday evening, glasses touched, conversations drifted between tables, and waiters moved quickly through the crowd. She had arrived 10 minutes early. Daniel was now 20 minutes late. She checked the time again and tried not to be irritated. A minute later, her phone vibrated. "I'm sorry. A client meeting ran over. Don't wait for me?" Rosalie stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it. This was the third dinner they had planned together that month. The first had been canceled because of a conference. The second because of a business trip. Tonight's excuse was different, but the result felt exactly the same. When the waiter returned, she smiled politely and ordered dinner for one. The drive home took less than 15 minutes. By the time she entered the apartment, Daniel had already sent another message apologizing. She read it while standing in the kitchen, then placed her phone on the counter and opened the refrigerator. 5 years earlier, she would have called him. She would have asked why work always came first. She would have demanded a real conversation. Now she simply reheated leftovers and watched a television show she barely followed. The argument had disappeared long before the problem itself. That was what worried her. The next morning, Rosalie arrived at the office carrying a coffee she did not really want. She worked for a marketing company that occupied 3 floors of a modern building downtown. Most mornings followed a familiar pattern. Emails arrived faster than anyone could answer them. Meetings began late and ended later. Deadlines appeared without warning. Normally, she enjoyed the pace. Recently, it had started to feel repetitive. Around 9 o'clock, employees were asked to gather in the main conference room. A new regional director was being introduced. Rosalie expected another polished executive with impressive qualifications and predictable speeches. Companies seemed to produce the same type of leader over and over again. The man who entered the room was not dramatically different. That was probably why she barely noticed him at first. His name was Elliot Reed. He looked younger than several department managers and far less interested in impressing anyone. During the presentation, he spoke briefly about future plans, answered a few questions, and thanked everyone for their time. The meeting should have been forgettable. Then something unexpected happened. One of the junior employees accidentally knocked a cup of coffee onto a stack of printed reports. The room fell silent. Embarrassment spread across the young man's face almost instantly. Rosalie had seen similar moments before. They usually ended badly. Instead of criticizing him, Elliot helped collect the damaged papers and calmly moved on with the meeting. Within 30 seconds, everyone had returned to their notes. It was a small moment, yet Rosalie remembered it later. Not because it was impressive, because kindness had become surprisingly rare in professional environments. 3 days later, a major client rejected an advertising proposal that several teams had spent weeks preparing. The rejection created immediate pressure across the office. Meetings multiplied. Deadlines tightened. Everyone became slightly less patient. Rosalie spent most of the following week reviewing campaign data and preparing revised presentations. By Wednesday evening, she was still working long after most employees had gone home. The building felt strangely quiet. She was reviewing budget figures when someone knocked lightly against her open office door. It was Elliot. He asked whether she had a few minutes to discuss the proposal. Rosalie followed him into a conference room carrying her laptop. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. What surprised her was not his knowledge of the project. It was his curiosity. Many senior managers entered meetings looking for mistakes. Elliot seemed more interested in understanding how decisions had been made. When he disagreed with something, he explained his reasoning instead of dismissing other opinions. By the end of the conversation, Rosalie realized they had improved the presentation considerably. more importantly, she had enjoyed the process. That realization followed her home. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when she arrived. For once, he was not working. A half-finished meal sat in front of him. The television remained off. The apartment was unusually quiet. Rosalie felt a brief moment of optimism. Maybe they would finally have the conversation they had postponed for months. Instead, Daniel informed her that he would be traveling again the following week. The optimism disappeared so quickly that she almost laughed. Neither of them argued. Neither raised their voice. They discussed schedules, packed deadlines, and practical details. By the time the conversation ended, Rosalie could not remember whether they had actually talked about anything meaningful. Later that night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The apartment around her felt familiar, comfortable, safe. Yet something important seemed to be missing. The thought remained with her throughout the following weeks. Work became busier. Summer approached. Projects changed. Life continued moving forward. Rosalie and Elliot crossed paths frequently. Though rarely for long periods, most interactions lasted only a few minutes. Sometimes they discussed clients. Sometimes they discussed strategy. Occasionally they disagreed. In fact, one of the things she appreciated most was that he did not agree with everyone. When he thought an idea was weak, he said so. When he believed someone was avoiding responsibility, he challenged them. The honesty made him easier to trust. It also made him easier to think about after work. Rosalie recognized the danger before she admitted it. That was the frustrating part. She understood exactly what was happening. The admiration she felt had begun expanding into something more personal. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it would pass. Neither promise felt convincing. A month later, the company organized a charity fundraiser for a local education program. Employees were encouraged to bring family members, clients, and friends. Daniel canceled that morning. Another work emergency, another apology. Rosalie attended alone. The event was held inside a renovated historic building near the river. Music played softly in the background while guests moved between exhibits and donation tables. For most of the evening, Rosalie remained busy, speaking with clients and colleagues. Then she saw Elliot. He was standing near one of the displays, speaking with a woman about his age. The woman laughed, touched his arm, and handed him a drink. Nothing about the interaction seemed unusual. Quite the opposite, it seemed natural, comfortable, the sort of familiarity that develops over years rather than weeks. A few minutes later, Rosalie overheard someone mention the woman's name. She was Elliot's wife. For the remainder of the evening, Rosalie behaved exactly as she always did. She smiled when appropriate, participated in conversations, thanked donors, discussed projects. No one would have guessed anything had changed. Yet, during the drive home, a difficult realization settled quietly into her thoughts. She had become emotionally invested in a man whose life was already complete without her, and the fact that this realization hurt far more than it should have told her something she was not yet ready to confront. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. Rosalie spent the weekend trying not to think about Elliot. The effort failed almost immediately. His wife appeared in her thoughts more often than he did. Rosalie kept remembering the ease between them, the way they stood close without seeming aware of it, the way they shared small moments that looked entirely ordinary from the outside, yet suggested years of history beneath the surface. Nothing about the evening had been dramatic. No secret had been revealed. No promise had been broken. Still, something inside her felt unsettled. By Monday morning, she had convinced herself that the feeling would pass if she focused on work. For a while, it seemed to help. A major client was preparing to launch a national campaign, and nearly everyone in the department was involved. Meetings filled entire afternoons. Deadlines arrived one after another. Several employees complained that there were not enough hours in the day. Rosalie welcomed the distraction. The busier she became, the less time she spent examining her own emotions. At least that was the theory. One afternoon, she found herself reviewing presentation materials with Elliot before a client meeting. They disagreed about part of the campaign strategy and spent nearly 20 minutes discussing alternatives. The conversation was professional, respectful, intelligent. When the meeting ended, Rosalie realized she had enjoyed the disagreement more than she should have. That bothered her. Not because of what happened, because she understood why it mattered. Daniel had once challenged her ideas the same way. Years earlier, they could spend entire evenings discussing books, politics, films, or future plans. Neither of them needed to agree. The conversation itself had been enough. Somewhere along the way, those conversations disappeared. Neither of them had noticed when it happened. That evening, Rosalie arrived home to find Daniel working at the dining table. Several documents were spread around him, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat beside his laptop. He looked tired, older than she remembered, not physically, emotionally. For a moment, she stood in the doorway watching him. Then she asked whether he wanted to take a walk after dinner. Daniel looked surprised. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Still, he agreed. They walked for almost an hour, through quiet residential streets near their apartment. The conversation remained awkward at first. They discussed work, neighbors, and rising rent prices, safe subjects, comfortable subjects. Yet as they continued walking, Rosalie realized something. Neither of them knew how to talk to each other anymore. The discovery felt sadder than any argument. A week later, the company sent Rosalie and Elliot to meet a client in another city. The trip lasted only one day. They traveled in the morning, attended meetings throughout the afternoon, and returned that evening. Most of the day passed exactly as expected. The unexpected part happened during the drive back. Traffic forced them onto a slower route, adding nearly an hour to the journey. For the first time, they spoke about something other than work. Rosalie mentioned a novel she had recently finished. To her surprise, Elliot had read it as well. The discussion moved naturally from books to travel, from travel to childhood memories, and eventually to family. It was the longest personal conversation they had ever shared. Nothing inappropriate was said. Nothing flirtatious happened. That was precisely what made it dangerous. The connection felt genuine. When people imagine emotional affairs, they often picture dramatic secrets and obvious betrayals. The reality is usually quieter. A person begins sharing thoughts with someone they should be sharing at home. The emotional shift happens so gradually that it feels harmless, until it no longer is. Rosalie recognized the warning signs. Unfortunately, recognizing them did not make them disappear. A few days later, she learned something that changed her perspective. The discovery happened by accident. Several employees were discussing healthcare benefits when someone mentioned Elliot's wife. The conversation revealed that she had spent much of the previous year recovering from a serious illness. Rosalie knew almost nothing about Elliot's personal life. Now she learned that while she had been admiring his confidence and calm leadership, he had been balancing hospital visits, medical appointments, and uncertainty at home. The information stayed with her, not because it made him more admirable, because it made him more real. For the first time, Rosalie stopped viewing him as an answer to her own unhappiness. He was not an answer. He was a person, a flawed, worried, exhausted person carrying burdens she had never seen. The realization should have created distance. Instead, It created understanding, and understanding, she discovered, could be just as dangerous. Over the following weeks, Rosalie made a genuine effort to reconnect with Daniel. Some attempts succeeded, others failed completely. There were evenings when they talked for hours and mornings when they barely exchanged a few words. Progress appeared uneven. Yet, for the first time in years, both seemed willing to acknowledge that something needed to change. One rainy Thursday, Rosalie stayed late preparing a presentation for an important client meeting. Most employees had already left. The office lights reflected softly against the dark windows. Outside, rain moved across the city in silver lines. Rosalie was reviewing the final slides when Elliot appeared beside her desk. He looked unusually serious. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he asked whether she had a moment. Something in his tone made her nervous immediately. They moved into an empty conference room, overlooking the street below. The room felt strangely quiet. Elliot remained standing for a moment before taking a seat across from her. His expression suggested he had spent considerable time thinking about what he wanted to say. When he finally spoke, his words were careful. He told Rosalie that he respected her deeply and valued the work they had done together. He also admitted that over the past few months, he had become increasingly aware of a change in their dynamic. Rosalie felt her heartbeat quicken. Neither of them mentioned feelings directly. Neither needed to. The truth already occupied the space between them. Elliot looked out at the rain for a brief moment before returning his attention to her. Then he said something Rosalie would remember for the rest of her life. If my life were different, this conversations would still end the same way. The sentence landed harder than she expected, not because it was cruel, because it was honest. As Elliot explained, that he cared about her too much to encourage some things that would ultimately damage them both. He spoke about loyalty, responsibility, and the danger of confusing emotional escape with genuine happiness. Then he said no, not angrily, not reluctantly, with certainty. Rosalie felt embarrassed for a few seconds, then unexpectedly relieved. For months she had been standing between reality and fantasy. Elliot had chosen reality, and deep down, she knew he was right. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Rain continued striking the windows. Traffic moved below. Finally, Rosalie thanked him for his honesty. As she left the conference room, she understood something important. The conversation had not ended a possibility. It had ended an illusion. And sometimes those are not the same thing. Rosalie left the conference room carrying a strange mixture of emotions. The embarrassment faded first. The disappointment remained longer. Yet, neither feeling troubled her as much as the realization that Elliot had understood her situation more clearly than she had understood it herself. During the drive home, she replayed parts of the conversation, not because she wished it had ended differently, but because she recognized how easily things could have gone wrong. A different person might have enjoyed the attention. A different person might have encouraged the attachment. A different person might have allowed the situation to continue until someone got hurt. Instead, Elliot had chosen a difficult conversation that neither of them wanted. By the time Rosalie reached her apartment, she understood that honesty sometimes feels harsher than kindness in the moment, but it often proves kinder in the end. Daniel was sitting in the living room when she arrived. A document rested on his lap. Though he was no longer reading it, he looked up as she entered and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Bad day?" he asked. Rosalie hesitated. Then she sat beside him. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence felt different from the silences they had shared in recent years. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like two people trying to find the right words. That night, Rosalie told him more truth than she's had planned. Not every detail, not every thought, but enough. She admitted that she had become emotionally attached to someone at work. She explained that nothing inappropriate had happened and that no boundaries had been crossed. Yet she could not pretend the feelings had never existed. Daniel listened without interrupting. The hurt in his eyes was impossible to miss. Rosalie almost stopped speaking. Instead, she continued. When she finished, Daniel remained quiet for a long time. Then he surprised her. 6 months earlier, he admitted, he had considered asking for a separation. The confession landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Rosalie stared at him. She had expected anger, perhaps disappointment. She had not expected honesty. Daniel explained that he had spent years convincing himself that work was temporary and that life would improve once the next promotion arrived, once the next project ended, or once the next financial goal was reached. The problem was that there was always another goal waiting beyond the previous one. Without realizing it, he had started treating their marriage as something that could be postponed. Listening to him, Rosalie realized she had done something similar. She had postponed difficult conversations, postponed uncomfortable truths, and postponed confronting her loneliness until it finally attached itself to the wrong person. Neither of them had intended to drift apart. Yet intention alone had never been enough. The conversation lasted late into the night. No dramatic promises were made. No grand declarations of love appeared. What emerged instead was something quieter and far more useful. Honesty. For the first time in years, both of them stopped defending them and started listening. The following months brought change. Though not the kind that happens in films, there were no miraculous transformations. Some evenings still ended in disagreement. Some conversations remained awkward. Old habits occasionally returned. The difference was that neither of them ignored the problems anymore. When tension appeared, they addressed it. When disappointment appeared, they discussed it. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. Trust, Rosalie discovered, did not return all at once. It returned through repeated choices. Meanwhile, her professional life continued evolving. The company launched several successful campaigns, and Rosalie's leadership attracted attention from seniors management. A promotion opportunity arrived during the autumn, bringing greater responsibility and a larger team. This time, she accepted without questioning whether she deserved it. Months earlier, she had searched for validation in someone else's attention. Now she found confidence in her own abilities. The change felt subtle but important. Winter arrived, the city streets filled with lights. One afternoon, employees gathered to say goodbye to Elliot before his transfer to another branch. This announcement surprised many people. Though Rosalie had suspected it might happen, his new role would place him closer to specialized medical facilities that his wife still occasionally needed. As colleagues shared stories and wished him success, Rosalie found herself reflecting on how much had changed since the day he first walked into the company. When her turn came, she thanked him for his leadership and shook his hand. Nothing more. Nothing less. The simplicity felt appropriate. Some people enter our lives and remain there for decades. Others appear briefly and leave behind lessons that stay much longer than they do. Elliot had never been the future Rosalie imagined during her lonelier moments. He had simply exposed cracks that already existed and forced her to acknowledge them. For that, she would always be grateful. That evening, she returned home through lightly falling snow. Daniel was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and fresh bread filled the apartment. As he turned and smiled at her, Rosalie realized something she had not felt in a very long time. She was no longer comparing her life to an imagined alternative. She was present in it, not because everything was perfect, not because every problem had disappeared, but because she had finally stopped searching elsewhere for answers. that belonged much closer to home. Looking back, Rosalie would eventually understand that the most important moment in her story was not the day she met Elliot Reed, it was the evening he said no. Because that answer forced her to face the truth she had spent years avoiding. And once she faced it, her life finally began moving in the right direction. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional English stories that help you improve your listening and vocabulary. Naturally,